Morning from the University of Notre Dame and the Clingen Family Centre for the Study of Modern Ireland. My name is Colin Barr. I am the Herbert Allen and Donald R. Keough Visiting Faculty Fellow here at the Clingen Centre and at the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all today to the second of our Clingen Conversations in the Humanities, Culture and Policy, which is a new series started here at the Clingen Centre to investigate the intersections between culture, policy, and the humanities in modern Ireland, and to continue the Keough-Naughton Institute's long-standing goal of bringing Ireland to the world and the world to Ireland and to Notre Dame. It's a real pleasure and privilege to have three really tremendous guests today to talk about in their very different experiences of filming controversy, which is the title of our panel discussion today. We have Bríona Nic Dhiarmada, Thomas Faber, and Kátia Lund, who I'll introduce properly in a moment. But all three of them have been involved in very high profile, extremely high profile, and very successful, critically successful, commercially successful, and I think intellectually successful projects that have the common thread, despite being focused on very, very different parts of the world, different time periods, and different events. The common thread of dealing with in a dramatized or documentary format, sometimes both, past trauma, past events in the histories of, and sometimes the very near history of Ireland, Germany, and Brazil. And one of the things I think we can explore today, or hope we can explore today, is how that challenge of filming, of dramatizing, of writing, and of responding to this reception and often critical reception of those things can be done, and what the commonalities are across these very different locations, times, and in some ways formats. The way this will work today is we will have a conversation, which I will start off in a moment, amongst our three panelists. We will have, if you see right at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A function, that will be open throughout. And what can happen, if you have a question, please just type it in. And those will find their way to me. And towards the end of our hour, I'll start trying to introduce some questions. And we'll get to as many as we possibly can. Please be patient if we can't get a chance to get to yours right away or possibly at all. But we are reading them, and I'm going to try and do as many as I possibly can. So at any point, if something catches your eye, something you'd like to follow up on, just pop it in the Q&A. I'll see that, and we'll move towards that at the end. But having said that, it's my very great pleasure to introduce our three panelists. First is Bríona Nic Dhiarmada from the University of Notre Dame, where she is the Thomas J. and Kathleen M. O'Donnell Professor of Irish Studies and concurrent Professor of Film, Television, and Theatre. Now, Bríona has authored more than 35 screenplays and 10 documentaries in both Irish and English, and has edited or co-edited a number of academic works, including for the Field Day Anthology. For our purposes, of course, Bríona is the originator, writer, producer, and executive producer of the multi-part documentary series 1916, The Irish Rebellion, which was narrated by Liam Neeson and broadcast on RTE in Ireland, PBS here in the United States, and many other places. And there was an 86-minute feature version as well, which was screened in cinemas around the world. 1916 was critically acclaimed. It was described in the Irish Times as landmark TV and won the award for Best Documentary Series at the 2016 Irish Film and Television Awards. I think to many of our guests and listening in today, you'll be very familiar with this production. It was a tremendous achievement, in part sponsored by the Keough-Naughton Institute here at Notre Dame. Something I know we're all enormously proud of, and the achievement that represents. Our second guest is Professor Thomas Faber. Tom is Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of Aberdeen, where he is my colleague, where he is also Director of the Center for Global Security and Governance. A graduate of the University of Oxford, Tom has held fellowships or taught at the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton, the University of Chicago, the University of Glasgow, and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Tom's numerous prize-winning publications seek to make modern German history, particularly those very fraught first half of the century in modern German history, accessible to a general audience while remaining academic rigor. They have been translated into at least 8 languages, His most recent book, Becoming Hitler, The Making of a Nazi, was published in 2017. It became a bestseller in Spain. It was shortlisted for the 2018 Elizabeth Longford Prize. And his earlier book, Hitler's First War, which is why Tom is our guest today, which was published in 2010, is being developed into a 10-part TV miniseries by Germany's UFA Fiction and Beta Film. And he was also a consultant on the 3-part German TV miniseries, also broadcast in America on PBS and in Ireland on RTE, Generation War. Generation War won numerous awards around the world, including the 2014 Emmy Award for Best TV Movie Miniseries. And finally, Kátia Lund. Kátia is an award-winning filmmaker, documentarian, and educator. Born in Brazil to American parents, Kátia was educated in Sao Paulo before attending Brown University in Rhode Island and beginning a career in film, at first focused on music videos and commercials. In 1999, she directed the documentary News of a Private War on life in Rio de Janeiro's Dona Marta favela. Its unsparing gaze and willingness to hear the voices not only of police and residents, but also of gang members and drug dealers was controversial, but also led to great critical acclaim. And the film was nominated for an Emmy after it was broadcast on PBS. Kátia is best known, however, for her work as co-director of the 2002 film City of God, which returned to Rio's favelas, this time in the form of a dramatization of the 1997 novel by Paulo Lins. Set over several decades in the 1960s, 70s, and early 1980s, City of God drew on an almost entirely amateur cast drawn from the favelas themselves, many of them trained in Cinema Nossa, an academy specially created in advance of the film and which continues to teach residents of the city's peripheral neighborhoods about the audiovisual industry, and a tremendous legacy of the film that endures to this day. City of God itself was a great critical success. It won numerous awards, including the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and a similar award from the Toronto Film Critics, and was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Director. Kátia now is working on a number of projects. She was explaining to me just before we came on air, my favorite of which is a project being developed for HBO Max in Brazil, a musical documentary with the express purpose of making people happy after what is now well over a year of pandemic, lockdown, and unpleasantness. I can personally think of no better thing to make me happy than a documentary on Brazilian music. So I'm sure it will be a tremendous success. But our purposes today are to look at filming of perhaps less cheerful, although by no means unelevating projects, if that's even a term I can use, but things that deal with the historical past, with trauma or the near past, trauma, memory, violence, nation building, myth making, identity formation. And Bríona, I'd like if I could to start with you. And I was struck in reading an interview you gave to the Notre Dame student newspaper a few years ago, The Observer. And you were talking about some of your motivations for making 1916 in the first instance. And you referenced Ken Burns' fantastic series on the American Civil War. And I was wondering if we could start by asking you a little bit about the inspiration you took from Burns and his very conscious national myth-making. I'm reminded of something Burns himself said in an interview, where he thought one of the reasons for the success of Civil War in particular, and he qualified this later with his focus on Vietnam and some other projects, where he said, I think his word was he elevated or adulated the American nation, and it was something that could bind people together across our partisan divides here in the United States. And I'm wondering if you had not an exactly similar model in mind, but a notion of using the story of 1916 as a way of making a conscious effort in the context of the 100-year commemoration for which it was released to build an identity for the Irish nation, or a myth in which all the Irish could share, particularly overseas with Notre Dame's involvement.
Well, I'm not sure I thought I was getting involved in myth making. I think perhaps what we were trying to do is interrogate the myths that were already there, But you're quite right about Ken Burns. I remember being at Notre Dame and watching the Civil War again and being really it had a huge impact on me. And I suppose it was because of the intimacy with which Ken Burns told the American people their own story, And of course, the Civil War in America is very controversial. It's to this day controversial. So I remember going to Chris Fox, who was then the director of the Keough-Naughton, and said, Chris, I would love to do something like this for 1916. This was about 2013, I imagine, 2012. So we were about 4 or 5 years out from the centenary year. And so I knew that this centenary demanded something. It demanded, I thought, a re-examination of 1916. Because I'm a filmmaker as well as an academic, I felt that it demanded a television documentary, history basically that would not dumb down, but something that would be compelling, that would get the biggest audience that we could to listen to historians, to listen to, I suppose, the story of what happened in 1916. So a bit of my motivation, I suppose, was to interrogate the facts, to see what actually did happen. And I was very conscious also of what happened previously in terms of the depictions of the Rising. For example, at the 50th year anniversary, RTE, or the national broadcasting station in Ireland, they produced hundreds, I suppose, of hours of television, including a big drama series, Insurrection. More importantly, for my purposes, they also did a lot of archival recordings with people who had been active in 1916. And later we had archival recordings of British soldiers who'd been there in the day, as well as volunteers who'd been in the GPO and other places, Irish volunteers who fought against the British. So we had all this material there, and I suppose what I hoped that we might do was to reassess, to get away from what happened in 1966, which was straightforward hagiography. Unquestionably, these guys were heroes, and it was very much these guys were heroes. Like when you looked at the pictures, you saw some women, but their stories really didn't come into it. You didn't hear about the civilian casualties. You didn't hear about the people who had gone off to die in the First World War, thinking they also were fighting for Ireland. So there were a number of lacunae, I felt, in the 1966 version. And of course, we had also moved on historically. But then also I looked at what happened 10 years later in 1976, on the 60th anniversary, and there was nothing. So it went from hagiography to amnesia, and then later to demonization. Right? So these guys were no longer heroes. They were basically proto-fascists. They were this small group of violent maniacs who were messianical, and really we should forget about them. So obviously we went on from there, and the big thing that happened, of course, was the peace process in Northern Ireland in 1996. So by the time we got to 2016 on the centenary, the actual situation on the ground was different. So I think it allowed us to have a more honest look at what happened. We'd gone beyond revisionism at this stage, and we were able to look back and say, do you know what these guys did? They were fighting for the freedom of small nations, and acknowledge what they did as an absolutely heroic act on a human level, but also to see, okay, to look at the political context and also say, well, what was left out in the 66 version? Well, women, for example, as I said, all the hundreds of the many thousands of men, Irish men, who died in the First World War, the civilian casualties of the week itself. So we wanted to put those back into the story. And also, I suppose I was looking at the events of that week almost as a fixed point, and sort of doing another thing, journey around my father. So I kind of envisaged it as a journey around 1916, to use as many first-person narratives as we could find, so that the viewer of the series would be able to imagine what it would be like at the time. Obviously nothing is unmediated, but by listening to the first-person narratives of the people that were there, to almost get an immediate visceral reaction, to the destruction, to the enormous human sacrifice. And then, of course, in the end, to looking back in a more measured way, we had historians, and only historians, actually. We didn't have commentators. We simply had historians, and wonderful historians, I have to say. So I think that whole melange of approaches, it really worked. Certainly we got fantastic response to it.
Sorry, thank you. It was tremendous critical success. It was reading through the reviews, just preparing for this and refreshing my memory, just really across the board. I wonder if I could turn and pick up on this theme of amnesia, which you were speaking about. And that was really interesting to me, the way in which 1916 has come in and out of the Irish historical consciousness. And turn that to Tom Baber, if I may, for a moment. Because, of course, amnesia is a key theme for the reception of series like Generation War or a potential biography of Hitler. It's not that the war is forgotten, but that the experience of common people is often occluded or overlooked. Now, Tom, I know you were a consultant to Generation War and had the role of an historian here, but I'm wondering if you could just reflect briefly on the controversy that Generation War generated precisely because of this idea of amnesia. I'm thinking about, again, the critical response, where, for example, the New York Times described it as a whitewash, but there was also sparked a huge amount of debate and discussion. I think The Economist referred to it as no previous German documentary or movie had sparked quite so much public debate. But I'm just curious, as an historian who had some involvement in at least the crafting or at least the later controversy over Generation War, how you think that theme, dealing with something that both can't be forgotten, but also has been forgotten at the level that Generation War was dealing, the common German level, how that might work.
Thank you, Colin. I think the fascinating thing here about the reception, well, I suppose both about what Generation War was trying to achieve, but also about the reception, is that we're dealing with different kind of amnesia. We're dealing with different kind of historical expectations, and maybe most important of all, we're dealing with different issues that people feel in the 21st century still, all these years later, remain unresolved. So let's start with the filmmakers. So the filmmakers thought that there was a real problem that in Germany, that there have been all these programs about the Holocaust, about top Nazis, about super Nazis, if you will, but there was a sense that there was insufficient focus on trying to figure out how our own families were impacted by this, but more important of all, what the mechanisms were that our own parents, our own grandparents could turn into killers, that it wasn't just others, that it wasn't just SS men. This was why the film was initially so phenomenally successful in Germany, I believe, because it did trigger these intergenerational discussions and deal with these issues of with an unresolved past in ways that worked extremely well, where local newspapers had all these fora where people shared how they for the first time talked to their parents or grandparents about this. But now, I mean, ultimately, there were also a few controversies in Germany, but let's keep that out for the moment. It's actually really just to illustrate. You look at the reception in Poland and in America. And I should also say the film was unusually for a German program. It was shown, I think, in about 150 countries. It had record ratings on the BBC. It had record ratings in Sweden and so on, because I think a lot of people found something universal about this, found something universal about looking at these mechanisms, how ordinary people can turn into killers. But now in Poland, where the film was being perceived as focusing too much on Polish collaboration, on focusing too much on Polish anti-Semitism, and where the insinuation then was, or the perception, I should say, but the perception was, here the Germans are blaming something on us. And the point, of course, here is, I think the point here is less about whether objectively speaking that is true. I certainly know from the filmmakers, nothing could be further from the truth. But the point is, why does this perception actually exist in Poland, and what do we take out of this? And at that time, I was part of a very kind of heated TV debate in Poland about it. And what I was trying to tell people is, rather than to actually now to say, well, look, you're just misunderstanding the film, let's try to figure out why this film means such different things to Germans and Poles. And it really points to a fact, I think, that even today, Poles feel that their victimhood is not taken seriously, that Germans don't even really, that from Berlin, New York seems closer than the Polish border, which is just 50 miles away, and that Poles are just sort of like perceived as cleaners or whatever else, and these are places where you don't go, and where people don't, where Germans don't take this victimhood seriously. And And I think in that sense, the film, despite maybe having caused this controversy, is actually, I think, also identified something really unresolved in German-Polish relationships. And maybe it has on one level made it worse, but maybe it's also created an opportunity for us. And finally, in the US, I mean, you pointed to the New York Times reception. There, I think the film critic, who was one of the New York Times star film critics, simply misunderstood the film because he watched it with American eyes. His experience was, or his expectation was, we really should be seeing here the death camps. We should be seeing the SS. And he thought, if we now have just seemingly ordinary Germans, German band of brothers, I think was the term that he used, who somehow are not in this death camp, and yes, they're all somehow killed, but they're not really fully committed to National Socialism, that he presented that as a kind of whitewash. And I think that is, and here we're actually dealing with, I think, with just a genuine misunderstanding of the film, because the exact opposite was what the filmmakers were trying to achieve, because their starting point again was everyone in Germany knows about the death camps, but we want to show how the people who weren't super Nazis still turned into killers. So I think in that sense, the reception of the film shows how there is unresolved drama there, how there is unresolved historical, I guess, tensions or unresolved history that we kind of all need to face in order to be able to move forward. And I think in that sense, the film has at least done some good.
Thanks, Tom. That's interesting. There's a couple of themes that emerged from that. I think we can pursue a few of them. I'd like, though, to give one of them, or raise one question to Kátia. But before I do that, I think it might be really helpful just to show everybody watching today a little trailer from City of God. It came out in 2002. It got a lot of attention, and a huge number of people have seen it. It's a tremendous film. But if we could just show that trailer very briefly and just refresh our memory.
Nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Director and Best Adapted Screenplay. Rio de Janeiro, the beach, the nightlife, the romance. But 15 miles from paradise is a place called the City of God. A place where one man must infiltrate a war between 2 crime lords to tell a story the world needs to know. City of God.
That's great. It's just such a tremendous film, and I do encourage everyone to go and watch that. Kátia, I wanted to pick up, though, on an image that I found really, really striking in the film, and there's a snippet up there in the trailer, but it doesn't play out the whole scene, where Rocket, your narrator, he's the lad with the camera there in the trailer, and he is taking pictures, he's documenting things, and he finds himself in a street. And he's taking pictures of the gang, and they're armed, and he sees behind him the Brazilian or the Rio police. And I thought that was just a fantastic metaphor for the documentarian, the filmmaker, who almost has to find themselves between 2 forces. And then picking up more specifically this idea of giving voice. And I know one of the controversies for City of God was that, and indeed for your earlier documentary, which the City of God in some ways builds on, was giving voice to not just marginalized people, but people who were involved with criminal activity, with drug gangs, and putting them on what was perceived to be a par with the forces of the state or the forces of respectability. I'm just wondering if you could reflect for us on that role, if you see yourself in Rocket standing between the two camps with your camera, or is that a good metaphor for thinking about filming controversy?
That's really interesting that you picked up on that scene. Someone told me once that every film has a scene, which is the essence of the film itself. And I think that scene is exactly that. You have Rocket, who's the narrator of the film, with his camera caught between a line of police pointing their guns, and on the other side, a line of drug dealers who are also pointing their guns, and he happens to be in the middle of that crossfire. You asked me if I feel that way. I feel like that to some extent, but not really, because I think that character Rocket is based on the writer of the book, Paulo Lins, and he grew up in the favela and he wrote about it. So he wrote the book. His instrument wasn't a camera, it was a pen. And I feel that my role in my life that's not really my story. I didn't grow up in a favela. I feel very incredibly privileged. So what I try to do is I try to collaborate with people who are trying to tell their story, just because I have access to instruments and to ways to do things. And so I really see myself as a helper, like as a collaborator, as a co-creator, trying to bring and work together with people who have such a strong vision and such a strong voice, and who can tell a story that hasn't been told yet in the film world. Or, that's why in City of God, I felt, I was working with Fernando Meirelles, who's the director, and we had a lot of discussions about who would the cast be, who would the actors be. And I really, at the beginning, there were suggestions of like middle-class actors, a professional, and we'll just, teach them how to behave, but or act. But I really felt strongly that there's no way you can teach someone how to act this. There's a certain look in the eye, there's a certain body language, there's a certain understanding of relationships that only someone who's grown up and lived those experiences can show, can interpret, can bring to the screen. So, one of our inspirations was like the film Kids. We discussed, is it possible to use this kind of improvisation? Can we actually use non-professional actors for a feature film this size? So, that's when Fernando and I, we decided to create a whole different way of producing a film in order to be able to potentialize, I don't know if that's an English word, but bring to just allow Paulo Lins and the actors to tell the story as much as possible and to get in the way as little as possible. So what did that mean? That meant using a documentary camera. For a while, we were, there was a discussion about, maybe we should use a certain style of film, which would be like The Informant, where it's very glossy and you have a camera and you have a track and a very fine focus, and the actor has to stop at a certain place and he has to say the line at an exact moment. And I was like, that would be a disaster, because we're going to throw out all this energy that these kids are going to bring, and the true, we'll say in Portuguese, vivência, their experience of what it is, and the spontaneity. So we decided to use a documentary type camera where we could improvise with them and let them be free, and the camera would run after the action. So that instead of them fitting into the camera moves would follow the action. So actually the whole style of the film wasn't created, as an aesthetic. It was actually the whole principle, the whole idea, which was, how can we be in the service of this unique and necessary point of view, which has never been told before? And so I would say that Paulo Lins is that guy with the camera, between the police and the drug dealers. And he would say, I saw more than 1,000 people die in my life. Every day people died. And the book that he wrote every time you get on a page, you think it's the main character. You're in his shoes, you're in his mind, and he dies on the next page. And then there's another character, and it seemed impossible to make this film out of that book. But we used the point of view of Paulo Lins, who was kind of a documentarian in his own favela, because he was writing about it. He was writing about his experience from the point of view of an insider. And that's, if it were me telling the story too much, we would lose exactly the gold, which is his point of view. So I wanted to be in the service of that point of view.
Thanks, Kátia. I was picking up on, and I'm going to shift the conversation in a moment, but picking up first on your reference to kids, which if I remember rightly is Larry Clark's film. And that was, and I'm casting my mind back a long time now, but that itself was very controversial for using amateur actors and giving that unmediated voice. And I'm almost thinking a very tenuous resonance, but to something Bríona was saying about being able to put the different voices from the past, the archival records, some of those audio recordings from 1916 participants that had been done, this idea of taking the mediator out as much as possible in putting together a film. And I never thought of Larry Clark being and kids being the link there, which is just as a fascinating bit of sort of modern cinema history. I wanted to turn just from that though, picking up something on Tom had said as well, Bríona, but turn to you. And I was struck with Tom's remark with Generation War, about the reception difference between Germany and Poland, and how the two different people see something very different in this film. And that immediately made me think of the island of Ireland. And I'm wondering if there was any reception or any response in unionist communities or loyalist communities in Northern Ireland, who, in seeing the 1916 story, however nuanced or historical it would be presented, they would see it through, as it were, an equivalent to the Polish lens watching Generation War. They would see it as adversarial, as implicitly critical. Was there a response? Did you expect that sort of response? And how do you think yourself about such a response?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Colin. And in fact, am I muted? No, I'm okay. As Tom was speaking there, that went through my head. I kind of picked up on that immediately. Because of course he talked there about unresolved histories, and of course on both sides of the island, we very much have an unresolved history. So one of the things, before I go on to the North and how it was received in the North, one of the places that it was shown was on BBC. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And in fact, we had a couple of queries. Is this told from an Irish perspective? And of course it is. We're telling it from, well, because I'm Irish, obviously, the Keough Television, where our production company were Irish, even though we were coming from an American university, it was an Irish telling of the story. The BBC accepted that, but they also said that they thought it was an extremely fair telling of the story. So I think, in a sense, by now, with Queen Elizabeth coming over to Ireland, for example, I think a lot of that unresolved history between Ireland and Britain, is beginning to be a little looser. So therefore, I think there was an openness to looking at this, because we were, I think, fair to all sides, because I don't believe in this objectivity. I don't think there is really any such thing. I think you've got to manipulate things to make it so. But within that, I thought we were trying to be fair. And again, of course, we were telling the story for that moment, for the centenary. If we're to tell it in 25 years, it might be a very different story that we would tell. In terms of the North, I really wanted to show it in the North, and we were invited to show it in the Belfast Film Festival. Now, the director of that, a woman that I knew, they received a number of phone calls. They showed it in a cinema in the Ormeau Road. So we didn't bring it to West Belfast. Right? We brought it to the Ormeau Road, which, for those people who don't know the geography of Belfast, it's kind of changing, but it would be on the outskirts of a more loyalist Protestant East Belfast area, as opposed to being in a nationalist enclave or anything like that, or nationalist stronghold. Where this film you would expect to have, reasonable hearing. They got a number of phone calls to say, you shouldn't be showing this, a little threatening. Not overly threatening, but a little threatening. They, of course, went ahead and showed it. But the interesting thing I felt at that was a number of people in the audience came up to me. and a number of people who I take it were from the unionist community, and said that was very fair. So we did get a hearing. I mean, I know the papers that covered it mainly would have been, say, the Irish News, which was a nationalist newspaper. We got very good coverage there. But I was really glad that at least, the cinema was packed. And it was shown on BBC. And we got very, very interesting responses back from the head of history in the BBC to say, we need to confront this history. And again, showing it in England, I showed it in a number of places in England. And a number of people made a comment that this should be compulsory in English schools, that English people need to know this history too. And I suppose another just point I want to make is that when Tom was talking about Poland and Germany and the way that those, that unresolved history between what happened in the war years plays out now, because it hasn't been resolved, and this documentary woke it up. In a sense, we were doing the opposite in this kind of a way. But one of the things that I found was, if you broaden out the lens, what we wanted to do was to get away from that Ireland, England, Ireland, Britain, that insular looking at Irish history, this exceptionalism, and to look at it again in the context of European history, what was going on in Europe when this was happening in Ireland, what was going on in the world, how did the events of Dublin, how were they impacted by what was going on in the world, how did they impact the world, how did they impact the whole anti-imperial struggle? And I think they impacted it greatly. In terms of India, Africa, and other anti-colonial movements. They did take inspiration. So we wanted to shift the focus a little bit and broaden the lens to see what different questions we might ask and what different answers we might come up with or not.
Well, that's really interesting. It's that playing with different audiences and receptions that's so interesting. I'm thinking in terms of that, if I could turn to you for a moment, Tom, and putting sort of your historian hat on, if you will. What is the challenge, do you think, in terms of a straight dramatization, such as Generation War was, such as the projected miniseries of your book Becoming Hitler would be, versus a fictionalized approach like Kátia has pursued it using amateur actors from the place, or roughly the place that's being dramatized or being filmed, or the more historical model that Bríona or Fallen Ken Burns uses? What are as a historian, what's a better mechanism, if better is even unavailable, particularly for things like the German past, which is so fraught and so difficult?
That's a great question. And I will probably now give an answer for which most of my professional colleagues will hate me, but I would actually say it all depends on the context and on the story that you will tell. I can think of various stories where it is precisely the traditional documentary approach that works best. And I think probably the 1916 one is, it works very well there, particularly with the kind of trying to explain the connections between the past and the present, the global, America and Ireland and all that. But in the context that I tend to deal with, particularly as with regards to the National Socialist past and Holocaust era crimes, we're dealing with a totally different issue, which is that we are still so much a victim of the pictures that were produced by the Nazis. So every time we see a documentary about Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, we ultimately see the images that the Nazis produced, that they wanted us to see. We see what Goebbels wanted us to see. So we as historians have tried to look beyond that and to destroy that. And the documentaries try to tell the story, but ultimately TV or cinema is, of course, a visual genre. So the pictures that are supposed to tell the story are then destroying what we're trying to tell. So I think, ironically, a fictionalization works better to tell the story, particularly of someone like Hitler, because we only know the Goebbels version of Hitler. I doubt that very many people who are currently listening in knows how the unscripted Hitler sounded. There's only one secret recording of Hitler when he was talking in a semi-private setting. you may want to, after this, you might just want to Google Hitler secret recording Finland or something like that. You will be surprised, because you will hear someone who's not shouting, who has got actually quite a decent voice. Where I'm trying to get here is that if we actually only look at the Nazi pictures, and typically just like the last 3 seconds of a 2-hour speech when Hitler is spitting and screaming, our image is that is Hitler. And when we then draw lessons for the present, is we have got to make sure that we stop people who are shouting like that. Then we think that the real danger in today's world are the kind of Charlottesville or Dresden style Nazis, and don't realize that is not even the real Hitler, that the real Hitler looks actually probably like us and speaks like us and has also winning sides. And so therefore, actually, because those images don't exist neither in a visual way nor in recordings, through fictionalization, you can actually destroy that image. You can actually, you can unmask Hitler and show the real mechanisms of someone like Hitler is possible. But of course, people also find it difficult to do this, because I think on an abstract level, people accept that is great, but then people are worried. Well, then people say, no, this is not what Hitler looks like, because the expectation is Hitler needs to scream. Or they're worried, well, are we then humanizing Hitler? And I mean, my response always said, well, that's precisely the point. The point is Hitler was not a demon. Hitler was someone, I mean, just like Thomas Mann says, brother Hitler, he's someone like us. The task has got to be how to show how a human being could be Hitler. And in that sense, actually, I would say as a historian, maybe somewhat controversially, often fictionalizations can actually work better to illustrate the research results of what we do as historians than documentary films can. Microphone to Colin.
Thank you. To turn a similar question to Kátia, in the sense, because you've actually done both formats. From Notes from a Private War is a documentary in a fairly traditional way, where you are filming the police, and you're filming the drug dealers, and you're filming the residents of the favela. But you've also done City of God, which, in the way you've described, is giving voice to this novel of a person who grew up in the favela. It's using actors from the favela, but is nonetheless a dramatization. Did you find, as you sort of reflect back on those two projects, that they just tell an important truth in a different way, or one was perhaps getting closer to what you thought was a way of describing or bringing to screen the realities of those places?
I also told this story through music videos with musicians, and I also told it as a mini-series where the protagonists were 2 children, 11 years old, sort of asking innocent questions and stumbling through this world, which has been created before, and trying to survive in that area. And I think that each format has its pros and cons. I like to use the documentary format in order to do the research and really become, immersed in the world. So I worked on News from a Private War for 5 years, and then I did music videos, and then through the music videos I started creating the style, which was later applied in City of God. So and then after City of God we did the miniseries. Each format accesses a different audience and a different part of maybe the documentary accesses the mind more, and maybe City of God accesses the gut and the heart, because you're in the shoes, you identify so closely with those characters that you feel like you are them. And you wonder what you would choose and how you would survive and what you would do in that moment. And that's what we did with using children too, sometimes in the miniseries, because they're 2 kids and they're trying to decide what to do. It's easier sometimes to identify with a child, because then you don't have all of the judgment that, and all the filters. So I think that each format actually complements the other.
Thanks for that. Bríona, I was just thinking in terms of, as I was listening, I'm not, preface this by saying I'm not comparing Patrick Pearse to Adolf Hitler. Let's just get that right out of the gate. But thinking in terms, you were speaking about how you wanted to address a previous telling of 1916 and some of the leaders of the Rising as being, I think you used the word proto-fascists, that was almost being a narrative that was being developed. How do you consciously deal with people who, and Pearse had his oddities, he's not a completely uncomplicated figure in a variety of ways. Roger Casement, obviously, there's the issue of the Black Diaries and things like that. How do you set about thinking about representing historical figures about whom believe, and again, let's leave Hitler off to the side completely here, but about whom there is a problematic set of beliefs or a challenging set of beliefs that you as the filmmaker think don't really reflect the story accurately or aren't portrayed in a very helpful way historically?
Yeah, I suppose it depends. Again, I really like what Tom said there about that all these things depend on what story you want to tell, what story you can tell, and what story is appropriate for you to tell in a way, depending on the context and the time and what you have, your resources. So I suppose there had been very little done on Pearse until about 1990, I think, or no, 1996, I think, with a documentary that was made, I think by Mint, which was called Padraig Pearse, A Fanatic Heart, which of course is drawing from Yeats's, out of Ireland I've come, great hatred, little room, etc. There wasn't even a question mark. It was Patrick Pearse, A Fanatic Heart, no question mark. So I didn't want to go there. Nor did I want to, to contest that either, because I think there was a broader story that beyond any one individual. I mean, there have been documentaries on Roger Casement. There was that documentary on Pearse, and another one, The Triumph of Failure. But that wasn't really what we were about in this particular documentary. In a sense, what we were doing, Colin, I think, went against the grain. It went against the current trends in historiography. We didn't do an anal thing. We didn't do a little slice of history. It was a much more old-fashioned, almost meta history, where we tried to explain, I suppose, a certain segment of the past in relation to what had gone before it and what then came after it. So it wasn't, and again, we tried to use this was very conventional documentary means. We didn't develop a new style, but again, it was fairly classical. And I suppose the whole thing was I really just wanted people to have access to their history, because for whatever reason, people, we think we always know what happened in 1916, but actually do we? So I suppose because it was coming out of university, that I suppose that almost pedagogic, I hate to say it, but someone said it was a great history lesson, it was a very compelling history lesson. And I was really pleased at that response because, we were there to inform as well, supposed to entertain, but to bring people back and to give their history back to people.
Thanks, Bríona. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. This idea of whether it's a history lesson or a civics lesson or in the case of Brazil, or a way of reflecting in terms of how Generation War, which is called Our Mothers, Our Fathers in German, this idea of dealing with the generation that is still alive or was present in the lives of people who are still today, that these issues that have so much resonance. And I wanted to pick up on a couple of questions. I'm watching my sidebar, and questions are quite literally pouring in, which is great. Please keep them coming. First one I'd like to take actually is picking up on a theme Tom raised, this idea of Hitler as brother Hitler, which is obviously a very controversial concept and would be difficult for a lot of people to think of Hitler as a human being, and that's why we should engage. This question comes from Roxana Spicer, and she asks, what's the current status of the proposed fictionalized series based on Becoming Hitler, Tom's book? And how would you, Tom, characterize the resistance to the film presenting Hitler, if that's what it would do, as brother, this idea of Hitler's humanity and how we would tackle that?
Thank you. I suppose the resistance within Germany against the program is less about that than the fear that Germans by focusing on Hitler, they might somehow return to the kind of 1950s where West Germans all blamed everything on Hitler, and if everything is Hitler, then it's just not German. Then it's not the fault of ordinary Germans. It's a kind of different version of the kind of New York Times review of Generation War, where the kind of the fear is if Hitler is a protagonist, and if Hitler is being seen as the central driver of the crimes of the Third Reich, then maybe ordinary Germans are somehow taken off the hook for this. And the fear then is that Germans today, they no longer look critically at their past, they just compartmentalize, they blame everything on Hitler, and therefore dealing with Hitler is really dangerous. There is an endless fear in Germany about the danger of dealing with Hitler. When Mein Kampf was published for the first time in 70 years in 2015, all the discussion in Germany was, while during the US presidential election, people looked at what can we learn from Mein Kampf for the present. Whether that works or not is a different issue. But in Germany, the fear was all about, well, if we all now read Mein Kampf, what's the danger to Germany today? So in that sense, well, I suppose the last point brings us to Brother Hitler. So generally, I think the resistance to the film and why the film still hasn't been made, and there the point is that well-known American streaming service was willing to pay half of this, but the expectation was that the German broadcaster would pay the other half. And this is where basically it was stuck, because in Germany, particularly public broadcasters, just find it difficult to have Hitler as a protagonist for very much the reasons what I've just mentioned, despite this being the kind of arguably best known filmmakers in Germany. But to just finish my point, as with regards here, this kind of fear about what it will do that people read Mein Kampf. The fear then is maybe that people somehow start to identify with Hitler, but not in a way like Brother Hitler, where of course Thomas Mann's expectation is everyone knows that Hitler is a really bad guy, but this lives in all of us and we have to do something about it. But the fear more is that people might find Hitler as nice Brother Hitler and therefore might copy him.
Thanks, Tom. We have another question coming in, which picks up on the title of this series, which is, of course, Clingen Conversations in the Humanities, Culture and Policy. And Patrick Griffin, who's the director of the Keough-Naughton Institute here at Notre Dame for Irish Studies, asked the question, as humanists, he says, most of us write. What does filmmaking do that prose cannot? What are its distinctive virtues and its drawbacks? I think I'd like to pose this to Kátia, because you've worked in so many different media through film. You've worked on music videos, commercials, traditional, if I can call it traditional documentaries, and City of God, which is just this astonishing fusion of some of these different things. What do you see as being able to be communicated through an audiovisual format, through film and its various manifestations, that speaks to these virtues of the humanities in a way that perhaps a book or an academic essay might not do as well, or just does differently?
I think that books are incredibly powerful as well. Literature. I think that Madame Bovary tells me more about what it was like to live in France in a certain period as a woman than reading any academic texts. So I think that literature and film, they work with imagination, right? So you're in the shoes of that person. You're feeling what that person is feeling. You're faced with the same difficulties and you have a point of view. I think that academic texts are very mental and very intellectual. And so they reach a certain level of analysis, but do they change the way we feel? Do they change the way we think and see the world? Maybe they do. And maybe they're complementary. Again, I would say that I wouldn't go against academic writing, but I think it's limited. And that's, to me, why I like to read novels. It's why I like to make films. And I like to get my viewer and put him in this point of view. What if you were born in the favela? What if you were a kid 11 years old trying to survive in a favela? How would you do it? And is that because, again, I think it's interesting when Tom and Bríona speak, that, you know, these people are treated as terrorists, or they're treated as proto-Nazis, and all those terms were used against children growing up in a favela. They're still called sometimes terrorists, you know, they're dehumanized. So how can I humanize them? I can humanize them by creating a strong identification of the audience with those characters, and having the audience feel like they are that character and take on that point of view. So that's how I try to humanize people who are otherwise seen as public enemy number one, a monster, a terrorist, you know, because that's how the favelas were treated up until City of God. They were, you know, or the documentary, cameras were not allowed in there. You're not allowed to listen to their point of view. They didn't have a voice. So how do you give them a voice, right? You bring the audience and put them in the shoes of a character and have them live from that point of view. That's the strongest thing I can say. And I think that literature does that too, really well.
Thanks. Of course, that thread of a common humanity, and how do we represent people, whether that's people who have been involved in political campaigns, that's people who are growing up in a favela, whether that's normal Germans, quote unquote, our mothers, our fathers, who are drawn up in the Second World War and led into doing horrible things. I think that's a common theme that develops this idea of film and controversy. That's a really useful thing, I think, for all of us to reflect on in these different manifestations in the context of Ireland in 1916 and Germany in the Second World War, and more recent history in Brazil. I'd like to sort of draw it to a close with a question I suspect that all of us would like to know, and it's an indulgently Irish one. So Bríona, this one will be for you. And we have the question here is, what drew Liam Neeson to 1916? And tell us, if you could, as a way of finishing off, perhaps not quite as cheerful as Katia's Brazilian music documentary, which I'm looking forward to. And I hope HBO will show that up here. But tell us, as a finishing thought, what drew Liam Neeson to this? And what was your experience of how he engaged with the material and what he made of it? Because his own background itself is a little bit complicated too. And we will finish with that. Yeah,
we needed a really good narrator. We needed a really strong person. So Chris Fox phoned Don Keough, who was alive at the time, who was a great friend of Liam Neeson. He got us the intro. Liam heard about the project. We pitched the project to Liam. And because of his background, because he was from Ballymena, because he never studied 1916 at school because he was in the north, they didn't teach 1916 Irish history. And we gave him the scripts, and he actually said, this is one for the ages. This is a vitally important project. And he threw himself 100% into what he did. He did publicity for us, pro bono publicity for us. We did pay him to do the script, I have to say. But I mean, his voice was absolutely fantastic. I think that, together with a really, really wonderful soundtrack by Patrick Cassidy, also, I think a combination of things. And to answer Patrick's question, what does documentary filming do? I suppose that a book had. It can bring all those disparate elements. You know, it can engage the head, it can engage the heart, and it can engage really ourselves viscerally. I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up. We're just about on our hour. It just remains then for me to thank all of our guests and everyone who's joined in. There will be another and final Clingen conversation in May, which we will advertise in due course, which will consider the subject of the Irish language and the new Irish, those people who have migrated to Ireland and have chosen to engage with their new identity and their new home through the Irish language, through the first official language. And we will advertise that with exact dates and times and panelists soon. And we hope to see you all there. But for now, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for joining us.